So we're getting into the text tonight. So if you have a Bible, turn open to Galatians chapter 1. We alluded to the first 5 verses, which is basically the introduction to the book, but now we're going to get into the meat of why Paul wrote this particular epistle to the Galatians. We talked a little bit last week that there's a couple different ways of looking at this book, whether it is written after Paul's first missionary journey to the South Galatian area, or possibly after his second missionary journey to the North Galatian area. And we are reminded of trying to keep context in mind, that who he is writing to is a local community. And even though we're not certain about the geographical location, it doesn't matter. There is not only Judaism in and around Judea and Jerusalem, but there is diaspora Jews that are all through the Roman Empire. And so you kind of have to keep these 3 things balanced. I personally think that this is probably a letter that is written after this particular missionary journey, which is recorded for us in the book of Acts, chapters 13 and 14. Remember, this letter is written prior to the book of Acts. And so the book of Acts is kind of looking back on this particular missionary journey. But you can see that Paul goes out not from Jerusalem, but he travels from Antioch up here in Syria, and he travels to Cyprus, then on over to the mainland in Asia Minor, kind of doubles back around, and then comes back to the home area in Antioch. Now, this particular arrow here that goes down to Jerusalem, you'll see what that means in our text tonight. He will make a journey down to Jerusalem. He will meet Peter there, and they will have a discussion. But he is trying to tell his audience of this journey only because he's trying to defend his apostleship, which is being questioned. So if you have your Bible, what we're going to take a look at is each section, but I'd like to read beginning in verse 6 all the way to the end of the chapter, which is only 24 verses, so you kind of get a feel for the overall flow of this chapter. So Paul writes in verse 6, "I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but there are some who are confusing you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we proclaim to you, let that one be accursed. As we have said before, so now I repeat, if anyone proclaims to you a gospel contrary to what you received, let that one be accursed. Am I now seeking human approval or God's approval? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still pleasing people, I would not be a servant of Christ. For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin, for I did not receive it from human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with any being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me, but I went at once into Arabia, and afterwards I returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. But I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. And what I am writing to you, before God I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown by the sight to the churches of Judea that are in Christ, that only heard it said, the one who formerly was persecuting us is now proclaiming the faith he once tried to destroy, and they glorified God because of me. So this is a passage that really gets to the heart of what he's trying to do in this particular document. He is trying to prevent a group of people from listening to some rivals that had followed him into the Galatia region, and he was telling them not to turn back from what he had taught them. So in this particular section, he's very aggressive, and he is not as kind as he is found in some of his other letters, even to the Corinthians, who had moral problems within its church. But he's taking this personally, I think. And as he does so, he is very defensive in the way he is writing chapter 1. So if you look at verses 6 through 9, one thing to note is there's not the usual greeting and salutation that he gives to the church. He jumps in with this particular situation where he is astonished. He uses this sense of shock that they are turning from what he had taught them, and they are tempted to retreat from what he calls the gospel. He makes a claim that what is being told to them now by a different group of people is a different gospel. And this different gospel can be a difference of emphasis and a difference of source. The idea here, I think, as you see on the screen here, is there's kind of a sense of betrayal. But as you'll see as we get into the following verses, even though he kind of feels betrayed, you can see why the Galatians might be suspect to listen to this other group, because they were Jewish and they had held to the law. And they had, at least to this point, only seen maybe stories about the life of Christ reaching out to Gentiles. There's a few of them in the gospel accounts, but again, the gospels are written after this. So anything that they would know would be of some type of oral tradition that had been passed down to them. At the heart of this, though, I think, is a gospel of freedom versus a gospel of fear. So Paul comes and talks about the grace that is found in the gospel of Christ. Others are asking people to not only follow Messiah, so they're Christians, they believe that Jesus is Messiah, but that they would also keep the Jewish traditions, such as circumcision, the Sabbath, and other things like that. Paul in verse 7 here, I think, is acknowledging that they are trying to pervert the gospel. You'll take a look at verse 7. And the way that he uses this is they are trying to confuse the Galatians. But it's interesting, that powerful word that is being used here, you are perverting it. This is not true. You have, you're misunderstanding the importance of this. And this I find really, really unusual. Twice in this paragraph, he says, let them be accursed. A sense of condemnation upon those, as if this is intentional rather than a doubt that what they had been told by Paul doesn't square with their Jewish traditions. And that's a heavy emphasis in this paragraph as well. So Paul is going to try to convince them that this isn't just a progressive advancement of Judaism, but it's a whole new revelation that was given to him from Jesus that comes from heaven to his calling, which he will in a moment tell us that God set him apart to be the apostle to the Gentiles. So in this paragraph here, what we see taking place is that Paul is affirming there's just one gospel, and it's a circumcision-free gospel. It's not something that requires keeping the law. And I want us to get a hold of that, because that would be quite shocking to people that grew up on trying to keep the law, seeing it as a sign of faithfulness to the covenant that God made through Moses on Mount Sinai. So do you have some questions in verses 6 or 9 there? This is an interesting word he uses, that they're deserting the gospel. It's a fairly common idea. You can see on the screen there that it was used in Greek literature to describe people that would change their teachers. So someone that might change from Plato to Socrates, or Aristotle, or something like that. Who are they going to follow? Who are they going to get their wisdom from? But it's also found in one of the apocryphal books as well, in 2 Maccabees 7:24, where it talks about deserting from Torah observance. And of course, in 2 Maccabees, trying to keep the law is especially important, because they are trying to get Antiochus Epiphanes and those that desecrated the temple out of Jewish life. We talked about that a little bit in previous studies. Paul sees the Galatians of actually turning back toward law observance, and he sees it as an act of defection. And it's kind of like the idea of someone who is a soldier that is deserting their post, or deserting their company, if you will. This defection has a timeline to it. We don't know how soon Paul wrote this letter after he hears word. If the timeline in Acts gives us any indication that after this first missionary journey, there would have been those that followed Paul around from place to place, and possibly not too much time has elapsed. And what we find taking place is these rival missionaries, Christians, but a different type of Christian that wants to hold to the law and to faith in Christ. These Galatians are individuals that are obviously Jewish Christians, but the biggest hang-up, I think, in this whole thing is not opening up their heart to what Paul feels is his calling to reach Gentiles, that is, non-Jewish people. And so perhaps the defection was kind of a line in the sand, that Paul came preaching grace and preaching freedom in Christ, but possibly knowing how often there was this tension between Jews and Gentiles, that maybe for some of these Jewish Christians, opening up their world to Gentiles was kind of a line, kind of crossing the line, if you will. So we have to piece all of this together, don't we? We're not told straightforward, but as we kind of put all these pieces together, we do know throughout the whole New Testament, but especially when Paul writes to the Colossians and to the church at Ephesus in the book of Ephesians, this idea of breaking down the middle wall that separates Jew and Gentile is a heavy emphasis. So this is a tension that's kind of in the backdrop of these local communities. You have some thoughts, some questions so far? Now, this surprises me. Paul is writing this letter in anger. There will be places in other writings that are attributed to him where, especially in the book of Romans, he talks about how he would rather personally be accursed than see his Jewish brothers and sisters found without Christ. But here he's throwing a curse upon what we would say is a brand new group of people that have turned to Christ. These are, again, we're not using the word necessarily Christian at this point because it's a further development within Judaism, but what we are finding is that he is talking about them being delivered over to some type of divine judgment. The idea of, these individuals being destroyed by God out of the anger that God has because they're perverting this gospel. I find that a little unusual. I don't know if you do. And the reason I find that unusual is I would expect Paul to have a little bit more understanding about how long it takes for people to change in the way they think. It's not something that can happen overnight. If these are Jewish people that grew up in the traditions of Judaism, it's not like they can unlearn all of that in a moment's notice. And so I'm kind of surprised by Paul in this section here. And quite frankly, there are some Christians that don't like Paul's writings all that much because of some passages like this. I think Paul does not anticipate what has happened to them. And I see in this section this anger that is welling up within him. It's even amazing to me here that he even refers to himself. Now, notice that he says in verse 8 here, but even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we have proclaimed to him, let that one be accursed. So it's not only these rival missionaries, he's putting a curse on himself. And I think the reference to an angel here is probably an over-the-top hyperbole. Let no living thing proclaim something different than what I taught you. And if they do, let them be accursed. And then he repeats it in verse 9, as if they missed it. So now I repeat, if anyone proclaims a gospel to you different than the one that I have taught to you, well, let that one be accursed. So it's pretty all-encompassing. It should be noted that maybe these rival teachers have this wealth of tradition on their side. History has led to this moment where they have been trying to keep the law of Moses. When you look at Deuteronomy chapter 30, there it's pretty plain: obey and you will be blessed, disobey and you will be cursed. Now, in that context, it's this idea not of eternal damnation. It's this idea that they won't enter the land that had been promised, that indeed that they would go into exile, and they eventually did, to Babylon. But maybe the idea of accursed here is not so much something that is eternal in scope, but it's this idea of what has happened to them in the past, that they would be held captive, that they wouldn't be able to experience the freedoms that they had found, at least at the time that Paul proclaimed this gospel, that they'd be going back into bondage. And I think we do see that a lot of times within religion, not just Christianity, but all religion, as that traditions and rules have a way of binding people and preventing them from moving on in their life or developing or maturing in their faith as well. So even though he uses this word curse, it might be something that has a little bit of Jewish context to it, rather than this idea of eternal condemnation. Esty?
I can relate to this because I grew up with the Baptist understanding of, yes, you're saved, you accept Christ and you're saved, but yet you have to keep that salvation or you could lose it. You have to behave, and maybe it's not a Jewish law that you're keeping, but you're keeping some sort of list of rules and regulations in order not to lose that salvation. So I can relate to this completely, even though it's not a Jewish law that I was keeping.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to keep, and I think that came from the influence of my dad was an Russian Orthodox, and my mom was Catholic. They grew up with the rules and regulations, and then you get into you're accepting Christ and you're accepting grace. But yet in the back of your mind, you can't get rid of all of that thinking of the rules, and the rules need to stay with you just to make sure that you're saved and that you don't lose it.
And even if you want to mentally move beyond that, it's easy to slip back into it.
Yeah, because you're afraid to let go of it.
Mhm.
And I can see where, through all of these Galatians, this was all new. The grace was new. I mean, it's easy to go back and incorporate the two and mix the two together.
Mhm.
Because that's what we end up doing.
Yeah.
Because we're used to it and we just kind of like blend it.
Mhm. Yeah, you shuffled the deck of cards together almost.
Yeah. And you make it work together.
Mhm. Good, thank you. Others have any insights, any thoughts, questions? Now, what I find interesting in this passage, it's almost as if Paul is saying, this is my gospel, because it was revealed to me. And that I find interesting because here we find Paul, I guess, kind of seeing himself as the entryway into the good news that no one else knows about. So there's kind of a sense of this is not only my calling, but God has put this on my shoulders. And a lot of times I think there is kind of a blinder on there, in the sense that God isn't doing that in other people's lives as well, coming to a better understanding of what faith is in Christ, that type of thing. It seems to me he's pretty narrow in thinking about he's the only one people should be listening to at this point.
Well, his conversion was so dramatic and so different than anybody else's. That's where I can see that why he's doing that.
Yeah, but he's still looking kind of through a window. You know what I'm saying? It's his experience alone, rather than seeing that God could be working in multiple places at the same time. So that's one of the things that strikes me about this
As if
paragraph.
he's the only one that got it.
Yeah, right.
Well,
Yeah.
well, this doesn't he say that he has never met the apostles, and
Yeah.
all this information he got was directly a revelation from Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So he thinks he's the only one that's got it right, essentially. And
Yeah.
because he didn't hear it from anybody else.
Yeah, exactly right. And the fact of the matter is, and this plays into this as well, where Paul says, hey, we'll talk about this in a second. I went to Arabia, and it was almost like he was doing some self-inventory about the life that he lived and the one that he's being called into. And number one, he never met Christ. Number two, he probably never met any of the other 12, the original apostles. He grew up within a sophisticated town of Tarsus, which was a seat of learning. It's on par with Alexandria and Athens. And all of these things are factoring into who he is as a person. We can't take away his humanity. I think sometimes we do this with biblical characters. It's kind of like we set them up as unique. And I see a lot of emotion in this. I see a lot of, I don't want to call it self promotion and self elevation, but at the same time, to think that only Christ appeared to him when Christ could have appeared to others as well. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of looking through a window, I think, a small window rather than a bigger perspective. But
Is he saying that that Christ never revealed himself to anybody else? Or is he just saying that Christ revealed himself to him, so he knows he's got it right? But Christ did reveal himself to his other apostles, so
no, I'm not sure that he's trying to say that Christ hasn't had an influence on the others. I think the emphasis here is he is an apostle to the Gentiles. And the only point I'm trying to make is simultaneously, God could have been calling a number of individuals to turn their heart toward the Gentiles, not just him. But
true.
but he saw himself as kind of the portal. You know what I'm saying? To this new ministry to the Gentiles.
Well, maybe they haven't been exposed to other apostles, and that's why he's taking it so personally, because he's the only one that has been in that region.
Yeah. Well, that's true. Yeah. And he always starts out at the synagogues. Okay. When you read the text in Acts, the first stop along the way is always first at the synagogue. And I can see why things would be heated in its argument. So you have Jewish people who've been worshiping God in the synagogue, some of them their whole life, and he comes in and starts talking about a new emphasis that God is working in, opening it up to the Gentiles, etc. You don't need to keep circumcision, you don't need to keep the laws, that type of thing. And I can imagine it got heated. And I imagine there was a lot of debate that began to take place. But you're getting to feel a little bit of what's behind and underneath the text. I think that's important. These just aren't words on a page. This is a life. This is a story. This is a lot of different emotions that are found within these paragraphs as well. All right. Anyone else? So Paul's main point, I think, here is that God is the initiator, and he's the one that guarantees that Paul's message of grace is true because it was from a direct apocalypse. Look at verse 12. It says, I did not receive it from human source, nor taught it, but I received it through a revelation. That's the word apocalypse in Greek, an unveiling. It's found down in verse 16 as well, to reveal his son to me. This idea of a revelation, something that has been hidden that now has been brought to light. It's interesting too, when he talks about how he's been set apart from birth for this. That kind of follows some other callings upon Isaiah, Jeremiah, and individuals that had kind of an understanding of a prenatal call upon their life to carry out a message. In the case of Jeremiah, exiles coming. In the case of Paul, it's this idea of there's a new way of looking at God's work in the world through Christ. So Paul's gospel is one that is shaped by the calling, the series of events in his life, and that's what he expects them to hold on to and to continue to observe. So from the very beginning of this chapter here, his main point is this gospel comes from God. It's not some type of human construction. That is, it's not built upon any type of self-works. It's not built upon self-righteousness. It's embodied in the grace that is given. And this self-giving of Jesus liberates people and allows them to experience life. Later in the letter, he will talk about this apocalyptic transformation in terms of a new creation that is coming. And Paul is giving this affirmation in light of his own testimony here. And it really does serve in contrast to Peter's mission. Now, we'll find out in chapter 2 a little bit more about this, but Peter's mission, it seems, is one to Jewish people. Here, what we're going to find is Paul's primary target is Gentile people. And they will come to an agreement that's found in Acts chapter 15, called the Jerusalem Council, of how much of the law Gentiles need to keep. And we'll get to that in the book here. But basically, what we find taking place in chapter 2, I'm looking ahead a little bit, is Peter's going to eventually come to Antioch, that church up north, and he has freedom. He has a sense of freedom, but then he slips back into disassociation with Gentiles, and Paul is going to call him out on that. Paul is going to boast in 2 Corinthians 11:24 that he received 39 lashes, and that's a Jewish reference there. It's kind of the idea of discipline, 39, not 40, that he is an individual that had experienced such persecution that he was under the sentence of condemnation by Jewish people and had received 39 lashes as a way of punishment upon him. So he definitely will pay the price for this message that he is trying to communicate to the churches. But his main point here is there is such a thing as a law-free gospel. And you don't need to keep the circumcision and other sundry laws, because in Christ they are fulfilled. They're completed. They're finished, that type of thing. So Paul is going to, while he alludes to being disciplined in 2 Corinthians 11, he's an individual, though, that was never disciplined actually by Jerusalem authorities. So he will eventually get to Jerusalem, and they will have this heavy debate. You might say it's the first church council on what to do with the Gentiles in Acts chapter 15. But he's never disciplined. As he tells the story, he is one that agrees to go out to the Gentiles and to have a cultural sensitivity to Jews that he will run across in the diaspora, in this scattering across the Roman Empire. So, thoughts there? Okay, verses 10 through 12 here is interesting. So evidently what these rival missionaries were accusing Paul of is being a people pleaser. In other words, the Gentiles didn't like Jewish laws, and if you're going to reach the Gentiles, of course you're going to modify the message to win over the approval of the Gentiles. So what Paul does is he talks about seeking human approval. And when he tells them that they should be accursed for the message that they have brought to these Gentiles, he then says in verse 10, am I now seeking a human approval or God's approval? In other words, if all I was trying to do is stay out of problems and conflict, I never would have wrote the paragraph that I just wrote, okay? And one of the things that he's going to do is say, he wasn't trying to please people. If I were still trying to please people, I wouldn't be a servant of this new revelation. I wouldn't be a servant of Christ. And a couple things to keep in mind here. We all know that people can use religion for a variety of financial gain. And what we find is that Paul is making sure they understand that he's not a huckster, okay? He's not a grifter. He's not an individual that is trying to seek approval so that he might be able to benefit from it somehow. So, Paul, if that's what he was trying to do, he would have never left his Judaism because he climbed the ranks of Judaism. He talks about that in the book of Philippians, that he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He was the best of the best. But when he met Christ, and that's part of his storyline, when he met Christ, that changed. And he had to rethink things. And while he was a Pharisaical Jewish person that had a pretty elevated status, pretty elevated education, those type of things, he's an individual that saw himself in a new way. And this word here, I would not be a servant of Christ, is it sounds kind of non-threatening, because really the way the Greek word here, it means a slave of Christ. I am now a slave of Christ. And he does that within his own upbringing. He had never discarded his Jewish heritage, but he did find a new way of looking at his life and the life of other people. And this idea of a slave, or a doulos in Greek, a doulos is one that his life belongs to another person. His life is to serve this new master that he has. Now, again, that's all within a subculture too. So he is obviously working within a subculture that had slaves and had masters. And he will even write in some of his letters about slaves, obey your masters, for this is right. So he never discards his Jewish heritage, nor is he uninfluenced by his cultural heritage either. So he talks about his own relationship with Christ within those terms. So what I think is taking place here is a setup. In verse 10, he sets up for this storyline that is told 3 times in the book of Acts, which is pretty amazing that the book of Acts tells his personal story not once, but 3 times. And Luke makes careful use of his storyline to advance the history of the early church. But in verses 11 and following, all the way to the end of the chapter, he will talk about some of these key events that led him to do an about face. He was a persecutor of the church, and now he considers himself an apostle. Now, that is something that will be debated, because here, those that are the rival missionaries probably are saying, well, he wasn't one of the 12. He wasn't an individual that sat at the feet of Jesus. He wasn't an individual that knew the tradition of Jesus as well. And so there's some doubt. And even in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, he has to defend his apostleship. That is one of the ongoing battles that he has. He is an individual that comes to know Christ later on, after Christ has been dead for a number of years. And as a result of that, there would be people that would question his apostleship because that was kind of a closed circle of individuals, right? It's those that follow Jesus through his earthly ministry. So in these verses, I think Paul is very insistent that he is just as much an apostle than the 12 that initially followed Jesus. And so what he's going to do is give us some particular mile markers, you might say, about what happened and how it happened. And these are to help him talk about his trustworthiness. It's about him being a genuine apostle, not a fake, not a pseudo apostle. And so take a look here at some of the details of his storyline. Begins at verse 11. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin. For I did not receive it from a human source. And for him, that's a benefit. While others would think, well, you didn't learn it from Peter. You didn't learn it from James or John. Where did you learn this? I mean, it just makes sense that rabbis have students and students have become teachers that have students that follow. There's this string of influence and teaching and learning. So, but he is boasting that he didn't learn from them. He probably never had ever met them. And he's saying, I know this, um, you know, intrinsically. I know this because it was told to me by Christ himself. Then he talks about his violent persecution of the church. He talks about how he was trying to stamp out this new movement. In verse 13, I was violently persecuting the church of God, and I was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. Now, the Jewish ancestral ways that he's talking about here involved a particular political program that when Messiah comes, he would defeat Israel's enemies. So this is more than religion at this point. It's also a political idea that he was zealous because he felt that the ancestral tradition that he had received was the truth, and that's what gave him hope, and that's what would eventually lead to their freedom. And I think that makes a lot of sense why he was so hostile, at least at the beginning. We're going to stamp out these uprisings of other movements because we're going to stick to the ancestry, we're going to stick to the traditions, and we're going to continue being zealots. Now, remember, even Jesus had zealots that were part of his inner circle. And a zealot had with it this idea of using force and violence at times to get its way. And that's certainly what the tradition that Paul followed. He was a zealot, and he gave approval for the martyrdom of Stephen. That's in Acts chapter 6. But he was an individual that was on his way to Damascus to do similar things, whether to arrest those that were beginning to follow Christ or actually kill them. We're not quite sure. But he was an individual that had this previous fierce, violent side to him. And he embarks upon persecution, whether psychologically or physically, or both, upon those who were following Christ. And at the heart of that, I think, is something that had built up over time. The Jewish people had always thought of themselves as the chosen people of God. And that is at the expense of other people who are not chosen of God. So there's this idea of election that's going on, and that kind of is a part of the Pharisee emphasis here. So Paul, he is an individual that is set on stamping out any rivalry, and then God intervenes. And when he intervenes, he comes to faith, as it says here, and he talks about then revealing, verse 16, his son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. Now that's where the problem is going to come in. So what he does is he decides that he will eventually go up and meet Peter. And before that, though, he goes to this area called Arabia. So he is an individual that seems to me to go back to an area that had some element of mystical encounter, because this area of Arabia refers to the Mount Sinai Peninsula, that area there where God met Moses, the burning bush, the revelation of the commandments, and that type of thing. Why did he go to Arabia? Is this a second giving of a new law in the same place that God gave the initial law to the Jewish people? That is a possibility. It might just be when you've had such a dramatic mystical experience with Christ. Maybe this was a period of self-reflection, self-discovery. You want me to do what? You want me to go to Gentiles? I had a disregard for Gentiles. I didn't even like Gentiles in my upbringing. I thought we were the chosen people. So we don't really know what happened in Arabia. All we do know is that he took his time there. And you'll notice it says here that after 3 years, verse 18, I did go up to Jerusalem to meet Peter, or Cephas, as it says in the text here. Cephas is another name for Peter. And at this point, I think you can imagine that initial meeting with Peter. Peter might have been a bit hesitant to meet with this guy who was once a persecutor of the church. He might have had his doubts about Paul, might have been an individual that asked, what is he up to? Might have asked, what is his motive in all of this? And that leads to what I put here on your slide. Paul is considered an outsider, and that includes this calling to be an apostle. So in verse 18, he kind of fast forwards. You'd think that if Paul really was building this case, he would have told us a little bit more about what happened in Arabia. But he doesn't. He skips right over that. And he goes straight to this meeting. Now, the question is, why did he want to meet Peter? Was it to learn more about Christ? Was he wanting instruction from an initial apostle? Peter is kind of the head, if you can call it that, of the group of apostles. Is it a way that opens a door for him to meet other Jewish leadership? Don't know. Did Peter tell some of his stories of his encounters with Jesus, his walking on water, some of the different things that he saw, Lazarus being raised from the dead, the transfiguration, a lot of these type of things. So we don't know. We have to just kind of, work in the mystery here a little bit. But it's interesting that he meets Peter for 15 days. Now, that's not a very long time. Doesn't stay there for months like he does at some of the churches on these missionary journeys. And he doesn't see anybody else except James, the brother of Jesus. And then he leaves and he goes back to Syria and Cilicia, Syria, where the church of Antioch is. He's an individual that grew up in Tarsus, not too far from there. And his confession is in verse 22, I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They didn't know him from Adam, you might say. Okay. So he returns kind of back to his home territory. And what we find taking place here, notice in verse 23, the one who formerly was persecuting us is now proclaiming the faith, the faith. That will become an important subject to him in his letters, the faith. The Greek word is pistis. I don't think he has a particular set of doctrines in mind at this point. I think they develop circumstantially with the churches that he's writing to. But the faith is this relationship with God and how we live out that relationship with God. Is it in the law or is it in the freedom of Christ? So in verse 23, there is this idea of proclaiming the faith that he had once tried to destroy. And so for Paul, proclaiming the faith is kind of a synonym for the gospel, which means good news. So proclaiming the faith, proclaiming good news. And faith is this ongoing subject matter in the New Testament. And here we're initially introduced to it in his story, but we're not given details on it at this point. More details are given in the following chapters to come. Some thoughts there? Anything? So one of the things that's really core here is this idea of tradition and revelation and how the two interact. He was heaped in tradition, and he has to kind of leave that, you might say, to receive this new revelation that is found in Christ. Now, I put too much text on this slide. It's a bit busy, but I think what we're seeing here is the ongoing struggle of how these two things interact. As you know, this past week, I mentioned this on Sunday, the Methodist Church made a pretty big pronouncement in now giving approval for gay men and women to be clergy within their denomination. And the pushback on that, as you know, the Methodist Church has divided into the United Methodist Church versus the Global Methodist Church. The United Methodist Church is affirming, and the Global Methodist Church is non-affirming. And what's interesting is how long it took. So they had this convention. It kind of blew up at their previous convention, which I think was 3 years ago, if I remember correctly. And they're finally coming to conclusions these number of years later. Now, the reason I bring that up is why would the Global Methodist Church push back on this? And I would suggest that a lot of what that had to do with their not accepting what now is accepted in the United Methodist Church has to do with tradition. And it has to do with how tradition sometimes takes over and refuses to progress. This is the way we've always believed, and this is the way we're always going to continue to believe, that type of thing. So feel the struggle of that a bit in this chapter. These who are rival missionaries to Paul, they're doing what comes natural as a human being, and that is to push back on change. And Paul is bringing about a huge change in relationship to allowing Gentiles to be a part of this movement, which is, at least at this time, a continuation of Judaism. It's not seen as a separate thing yet. So Paul, I think, is trying to encourage the development of faith, that it always has to move on and it has to continue to grow. And that at times means letting go of the traditions that sometimes has come before. And that's a hard thing for people, a very hard thing. The other thing that I kind of sense in this chapter is Paul, because he's so over the top in some of the things that he's saying, it would be easy to think, Paul, you are so full of yourself. I mean, come on now. You have a little more realistic perspective on your life, have a little bit of humility and stuff. But we who have lived all these years later, and we are accustomed to Paul, we're used to Paul, we're, that type of thing. I don't think we feel this tension quite as much as what these individuals who are hearing him and wondering what to do with what they know about their religion. And now here comes, as I put here in the slide, kind of a lone wolf apostle who's changing the message. And yes, he's claiming that he met with Christ. Where is the circumstantial evidence of that? Where are the witnesses of that? Are you making that up, Paul? I mean, you could tell me anything. So just at the start of this letter, you have to feel that tension. You have to feel that these people that he's condemning are not people that are violent, aggressive resistors of Judaism. They love their Judaism, but they're having trouble wrestling with the changes that Paul is promoting. So you have some thoughts there about this tradition and revelation and progressive understanding of the nature of faith? Anyway.
Well, I don't think it's much different than what we have today.
That's exactly right. It is an ongoing deal, I think, throughout church history. A lot of times we look back on the early days of the church kind of through rose-colored glasses. And I think I did this as well for many years. Oh, if we could just get back to the early church, if we could just get back to that Acts 2 type of church, when everybody was taking care of each other and serving each other. But that's only one paragraph in the book of Acts. And the rest of the New Testament has a lot of division and arguments that are going on. And I think that's a part of the human experience. I really do. So you're right. It's something that is continued to this very day. All right, I think I have one or two more slides. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about his zealousness and the persecution. I don't think we need to spend too much more time on that, but there's some subpoints there that you can look at. There's kind of a caricature here, you might say, of what zealousness does in all religions, not just in this situation. That when zealousness takes over, it can be harmful to women, it can be harmful to children, it can be harmful to people that are not of your religion. It can try to control other people, it can try to deny civil rights, all that type of stuff. it seems as though the cross and the gospel that extends from the cross of Christ is the central symbol that will short circuit a lot of justifications for violence and what religion tends to do by forcing other people to convert, that type of thing. So what Paul does as he kind of winds down in this chapter is take an oath, which is interesting. In verse 20, he says, "In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie." So he takes an oath before God, and implied within that oath is that there's punishment that will come from God if he misrepresents God. I find it interesting that we still follow that same protocol. When a person places their hand upon the Bible, raises their hand and says, "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me, what, God." This idea of an oath that is going to certify the truthfulness that comes from that witness. Well, that's not always what happens. We know that people lie on the stand in a courtroom situation. However, in this case, what Paul is trying to do is saying that he's not lying, that he's telling the truth on what has happened to him. And he'll need to tell this story over and over again, I think. So as he goes up to Jerusalem, the thing to look forward to next week is in verse 1 of chapter 2. So he goes just for 15 days to visit Peter. He sees James. We'll see next week that 14 years pass by before he goes back to Jerusalem. So this is not, you're talking about a 2-week stint in Jerusalem in 17 years' time. So I think that explains a lot too about how Jerusalem church has been functioning all this time without the influence of the Apostle Paul. He'll come back from a missionary journey, and then they're going to have to call a council to iron some things out about how does Christianity, as we call it nowadays, and Judaism blend together? How are we going to make it work? So the last line, though, I find here in chapter 1 really encouraging. It says that they had this opinion: the one who formerly was persecuting us is now proclaiming the faith that he once tried to destroy. And then this line, I think, is great. "And they glorified God because of me." In other words, on these missionary journeys, there's kind of a wipe of the brow moment when they go, he's not here to kill us. He's not here to persecute us. He is here to minister to us. And he says, people praise God for the change in my life. And he'll get more into that in chapter 2 a little bit. So that's our time for tonight. I want to see if you have anything else that you want to talk about before we finish our time here this evening. If I can stop this share, if my mouse will cooperate with me here. Guess not. Come on. I don't know. Oh well. Anything else that you have in mind here tonight before we finish up? There we go. There it is. It wasn't cooperating with me. Any questions? Any comments? It's going to be an interesting book. I think it will draw some similarities to what we often see within contemporary Christian circles and movements and that type of thing. So, anything else that you have in mind? If not, we will call it an evening, and hope you have a great rest of the week. And we'll look at chapter 2, or at least part of it, next Wednesday night. Okay?
Okay.
All right.
Night.
All right,
Good night.
thanks. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.